In early to mid-October of 1981, I was 17 years old. I was working weekends in Fayetteville, a town 28 miles from where I lived in Siloam Springs. I usually left for work around 5:30 in the morning. I would drive the old Highway 68 towards Fayetteville, Springdale. One morning, I was on my way to work as I was coming close to where Fairmount Road was. I could see something by the bridge at first. I thought it was a coyote or a large dog scratching around the bridge with its back legs. As I got closer, I realized it was not, and that it was actually a Sasquatch. It was reddish-brown in color, and I could see its face area had almost no hair, and the skin tone was lighter than the rest of it. It looked up at me as I passed on over the bridge. My car was a Volkswagen Bug, and the lights were not very bright. It seemed to be startled. I looked into the rearview mirror to see it jump up and run across the road. It moved in long strides and very quickly. It was tall, maybe close to 7 feet, and was thinner than I would have expected it to be. The activity it seemed to be doing when I first saw it was digging at the ground next to the bridge. The motion it was using was similar to what primates do. The manner in which it moved across the road was, however, more like a human would move. I did not see anything. I did hear a lot though, and while in a boat fishing with 2 friends, we were along the shoreline, joking around and trying to catch something, when we heard a very large animal rustling in the woods. The animal and object was not at all that far from us, but we could not see due to the dense vegetation and the low light conditions. The creature did sound to be very large, and the thrashing of the vegetation became louder. The 3 of us in the boat did begin to speculate what we were hearing, and none of us were worried until we heard the shrill from this animal. It can only be described as very loud, bone-chilling, and did, fact, strike fear in all of us. We began to pull our lines and start the boat ASAP to leave the area, and the animal began to run away from our location. I think the direction was southeast, if I'm correct. We still could hear the animal moving through the dense vegetation at a fast pace with no apparent problem. The animal continued to shrill on occasion, stopping approximately every 200 or so yards. The distance the final shrill was heard at was approximately 1/4 to half a mile away through dense woods and vegetation, up a hill. The time frame which this took place in was so fast we were unable to think of an animal which could sound so large and have such a deep shrill, and of course move so fast. The shrill was not as any other animal I have ever heard, nor was it the 2 other people I was with. The shrill was later heard by me, approximately 2 years later while on my way home from work. I was listening to Art Bell, and Bigfoot was the topic, and somebody had an audio of a Bigfoot. When the audio was played, I again became afraid, speechless, and the hair on my neck stood up, and my eyes teared. To start this off, there are 0 bear, moose, or elk where I lived at the time. Background info. At the time, I was around 12 or 14, and I was with my friend who I'll call Kayla. We planned on going to a picnic in her pastures. As we walked up a smaller hill, Kayla pushed me to the ground and whispered to me, "Do you see that?" At least 20 or so feet away was a tall creature. It stood on 4 thin limbs, and its head was narrow, similar to that of a horse or a deer. It was completely black. I couldn't make out features, but it had a mane just like a lion, but it seemed flat and coarse. The mane, like fur, ran along its back, stopping near the rear. It had no tail. Here's a side note. All of the cattle were moved to a completely different area. Nowhere near this one. No other livestock animals were in those pastures. But this thing was just staring off. Suddenly, my friend stood up and made a beeline for the exit that was at least 2 miles away. I didn't hesitate to follow her. We finally stopped near the latched fence that led to her house and looked back. We had a pretty good view of the hill it stood on. It was slowly walking back into the trees. This still gives me chills to this day. I was standing about 10 feet down in the forest, around a deep ravine, not really too far from the house, but it was right next to a patch of woods, going back further south into the national forest. The narrow patch of woods then stretched on northward. Leaves were on the ground. That was the first thing that impinged on my consciousness, the sound of something walking through leaves. It was a measured long tread, I could tell. I started really looking around, trying to see what was making those sounds. I was much braver back then. Then, over on the other side of the ravine, close to the bottom, but definitely walking uphill, I saw it. For all of about 3 seconds, seemed like longer at the time, and about 50 to 100 yards away, it was very large and I could see that it was hairy. I could see the ground between its moving legs and some vague image of arms, but not the head. Some forest branch obscured my view of the very top part of the body. I could tell it was walking upright, uphill. It was not a bear. It was standing with a purpose up on the hill on the other side. It was quickly out of sight. Now, I know I wasn't thinking clearly, because I decided I had to try to get a better look at it. So I ran as quickly as I could around the rim of the ravine. Since its origins began in our front yard, which is not the best playground, I can tell you. Anyway, it didn't take me long to reach the other side and move down into the woods slightly to look around and see if I can find it again. It did not see it again. I was there for only a minute or so when it suddenly occurred to me that I didn't hear anything anymore at all. No sounds, no birds, no nothing. And fear like I'd never known before hit me, and I went running, practically screaming back to the house. I told her what I'd seen, and she of course did not believe me, my mother, though she told me to never tell anyone else the story. For a long time, I didn't tell a soul, except family members, but of course, they didn't believe me. It didn't help that only 1 or 2 people since then truly believed that I saw a Bigfoot. Since then, I have had lots of trouble going out alone in the woods. While no one actually calls you a liar, they look skeptical, and you can tell they either think you've been drinking or drugging or saw a bear. On December 4th, 2005, at approximately 8:15 a.m., I was standing approximately 50 yards from the southwest corner boundary marker of my property when I heard the neighbor's dog start to bark and run southward toward Arkansas Highway 7. They only ran a short distance before stopping. I immediately thought that they must be barking at a deer that was crossing the road. My first thought was to get my gun from my truck. Then I remembered that I had parked outside the fence in front of my house. So, I decided to just stand there and see if it was a doe or a buck and hope it would not feel pressured since the dogs had stopped barking. I also believed the deer would just change directions if it saw me hurrying in its same general direction. Therefore, I just stood still and waited in hopes of getting a glimpse of it. Then, if the dogs would keep quiet, I could hunt it later. Only one got to see it for 2 to 3 seconds, but I saw it clearly. My first impression was that I was observing a very large man who was wearing a hooded black parka. Then I realized it was some kind of animal. It was approximately 50 yards away and was on the opposite side of an old fence that had been overtaken by grass, weeds, and vines. I only had a left side view of it as it was traveling east along an old fence row. It covered a distance of about 20 yards in just 3 seconds. I could only see its upper body. I could see that it was not a bear, but I couldn't make out distinct facial features from the side from that distance. It was like an ape in some ways, but its posture appeared more man-like. I can best describe the size by comparing it to a very large man I know, who is approximately 6'9" and weighs 280. This creature was at least that tall, possibly a little taller, but close to that same build. I did not get a long view of it. I probably would not have had the time to take a picture, even if I would have had a camera in my hand. It was moving at a very brisk pace, but not lightning fast. Its stride resembled a trot or even a jog. The body was moving quickly, but there was no up and down motion. It appeared to have a moderately thick coat of black hair. From what I could tell, its face was dark too, as if there was some hair on the face. It was moving through a well-used deer crossing. There's an old fence row there, on both sides of Arkansas Highway 7. The west fence row had recently been cleared and the east side was logged about 5 years ago and has a fair amount of undergrowth and a game trail running along the south side of the fence row. Just a little to the southwest of the spot, there is a thicket that is approximately 3 acres in size. There are a couple partial open areas in the woods there. Most parts of this thicket can be walked through fairly easily. In places, the thicket is too thick to move through without clippers and/or a machete. I did not see where the creature crossed Arkansas Highway 7, but it most likely came from an area that is about 40 yards away from the highway's west side right-of-way. I believe that this creature waited until there were no cars coming before crossing the road. I did not get the impression that it was running from something. I have mentally replayed the entire scenario many times, and I have stood and looked at the same area where the creature was seen. I looked for tracks after the incident, but the ground was too brushy for obvious tracks. I've stood in the spot where I observed the creature from. I've watched as vehicles traveled north along Arkansas Highway 7 and considered every other possible scenario. It wasn't any kind of illusion. I was there, and I saw it. When I was about 13 years old, I went trout fishing with my mother and aunt on the White River in Arkansas. We were staying at a motel in Bull Shoals. One morning, we drove to a remote area of the river to fish via an unknown dirt road. We stopped to fish a bend of the river. On the opposite side of the river, which was west, was a tall stone bluff with a slight overcrop from erosion. On the east side was flatter land with 12 to 20 foot thin scrub trees, about 20 to 30 feet from the water, as the river was low. While my mother and aunt were fishing off the bank, I decided to try my luck further up the river, about 300 yards away and just out of sight with my mother. While I was fishing along the bank, I began to hear rustling sounds in the trees and shrubs behind me. I looked in the direction of the noise and could see in the tops of these thin trees moving as if something were walking through them and pushing them to the side. But due to the thickness of the vegetation, I could not see what was actually moving the trees. I stood and observed this activity for 2 to 3 minutes. I began hearing grunting type sounds that were very deep and substantial sounding. These sounds were similar but different than grunt sounds a bull would make. The movement of the trees began to appear as if something were shaking the trees at this point, instead of moving through them. It appeared that whatever was making the noises was only about 10 feet inside the brush, yet I could not see what it was. Feeling nervous, I decided whatever was in the brush moved with me, step for step. As I walked the movement in the trees, it seemed to be more forceful, with the sounds of large branches breaking as it moved. When I got within sight of my mom, which was about 50 yards, all activity stopped. I informed my mother there was something in the brush following me, but of course, she shrugged it off. Within a few moments, we decided to leave as we were not catching any fish. I'm having a hard time remembering the stories told to me by my Navajo family. But when I Skype with them again, I will ask for me. This creepy set of events happened directly to me though, so here goes. My first personal encounter. I know it's lengthy, but hey, Skinwalkers, they do require a backstory. It started when my 2 brothers, who we'll call David and Luke, and Luke's girlfriend, who we will call Sarah, all drove down to the desert to spend some time out in the country. This is reservation land, as it were, so red dirt was everywhere. This was in southern Utah, a majestically beautiful place if you ever get the chance to visit. We had some pistols and decided to go out and target practice. We took our gear and some old targets to a place called Devil's Heartbeat. I had never been, but all three of them were familiar with the area. It was a canyon about 200 or so feet deep. We stayed on one end of the canyon, by the drop-offs, and to our left was the ravine. About 50 feet over, the opposite side of the canyon rose up above us, where some other ruins were. The Navajo may disagree with historians on the Anasazi's origin and departure. According to Navajo legend, they simply disappeared from existence, leaving behind plates, dishes, food, and went into another dimension, or some equivalent. But, whatever the history, the Navajo do not like to wander in the ruins. I never asked why, but figured it had something to do with disrespect, preserving history, etc. As such, none of the others cared a bit about these canyon ruins. They were more interested in shooting pistols. I could see old beds, ladders, and even cave drawings on the cliffs with just my naked eye. And I got this strange fixation on going over there. I'm not Navajo, and felt that their rules didn't apply to me. I set down the cliffs without a rope and decided I would climb down, cross the canyon floor, and then climb back up. This was a bad idea for a million reasons, but it was just like some obsession. I can't explain the feeling. It was the magneticism. I wanted to be in those ruins, and it wasn't just a touristy-like curiosity. It felt like I was meant to go there. I kept slipping and kept getting stuck on the rocks. I was so frustrated I almost started crying. Finally, I was deterred by the unmistakable sound of a growl coming from the canyon floor below me. There were trees down there, so I couldn't see what was making the growl, but a mountain lion immediately rose to my mind, and I got my ass back up to the cliffside. I said nothing to the others, and we shot guns for a while. The only other strange occurrence was while Sarah was aiming, things got eerily quiet. We all heard a sound from behind us, maybe 20 feet away. It was almost a growl, but then a hoarse laugh, almost like a lion, and then a hyena. We had a clear view of the entire area, and there was nothing. Certainly not on the cliff tops where we had heard it anyway. The creepy part was that while David, Sarah, and I all heard it from a close distance, Luke heard the exact same noise, right by his ear. We ended up camping out there to see if anything would happen, and this is when I got completely terrified. Before, I was only scared of wild animals. We had guns though, and were sleeping with no bags or tents, just some blankets under the stars, and a little flare, so I felt safe when we all laid down. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up a few hours later to see everyone else lying with their eyes wide open, listening. The canyon was completely full of noise. The only way to describe it is people banging rocks together. There would be one set, maybe 300 yards away, then another clacking 200 yards away, and then 50 yards away. The canyon echoes, so it was hard to tell exactly how many rock-smacking rock noises there were going on, but they sounded like Morse code. We listened to this for maybe 10 minutes. No other animal noises. Nothing. Finally, David, who is kind of a hard-ass and the least superstitious, shouted, "Shut up!" And everything immediately stopped. My heart was in my throat. We just sat there and stared at one another, wide-eyed. It was dead quiet. And then we heard another super weird noise from the ruins. I don't know how to explain this one either, but it kind of sounded like a zebra noise. like these squeaky trills. It got louder, and then the rocks, sticks, whatever they were, started up again. But this was worse, because now other animal noises came. We heard what sounded like wolves or coyotes barking, monkeys screeching. In my opinion, those were the most terrifying. Owls hooting, and through it all, the terrible zebra noises. We said nope, and got our happy little asses out of there immediately. It took us maybe 10 minutes to douse that fire, pack our blankets, and speed away. And the noises were continuing the entire time. That night, I was obviously pretty shaken up. Before I could fall asleep again, my Navajo mother came and sat by me and said that she could tell I had a rough day. We hadn't mentioned the creepy shit to avoid a lecture about fucking with spirits. She asked me about it, and I ended up spilling my guts about not seeing the canyon ruins. It was something personal. It felt like it. I wanted to go there, so why couldn't I? It would have been beautiful. After I told her all about it, I could see that she had a really concerned look on her face. "What is it?" I asked, totally confused, and she explained something I had no idea about. The spirits in the ruins like to lure people up. When they get up on the ground, the spirits push them off. That's why we don't go there. I remained creeped out for the remainder of the visit. The town has a public access kiva, kind of a tourist trap for a little podunk place, but since I didn't see the ruins up close, I went down into the kiva, and I went alone, as of course my superstitious family refused to enter other natives' dwellings. I figured that nothing could push me off a cliff, if I was in a kiva. I was right, but something even worse happened. Fast forward to a few weeks later, I worked a shitty call center in Salt Lake City, 3rd shift. It was my first night alone, and I was feeling jumpy ever since the kiva. My brothers already warned me that I had a skinwalker following me, but of course didn't believe it. I don't smoke, but I followed my coworkers out for smoke breaks because I'm talkative and I like to chat. Tonight, I lurked in the doorway because I had this horrible cloud of dread hanging over me. I was peeping out the glass door and being a total weirdo. It hit me then how paranoid I had been. That's what skinwalkers do. They mess with your mind. While I was pacing on the front of the glass doors, I decided that this whole thing was stupid, and I was going to go outside and stand there for the rest of my 10-minute break. Most of the smokers were already filling back in, but I walked out and put my hands in my pockets, looked at the sky, looked at the building, mentally patting myself on the back for not being a pussy. Then I saw something that I will never be able to give a rational or even halfway accountable explanation for. We have like 6 parking lots. In one of the lots far away from me, maybe 100 feet, I could see something walking. It was a dog, obviously, but it was almost limping and walked like it was tired or hurt. Animal lover me forgot all about skinwalkers, and I started walking toward it, making the "come here, doggy" noises. And then I stopped abruptly. The dog had the body, form of a greyhound, and it was gray, but there was something very, very wrong with it. It had bloody legs and limped, but it walked more like a person would on feet and hands. Its butt was moving to and from, if that makes any sense. When it heard me, it just stopped without turning, something I've never known any dog to do. And finally, it looked over its shoulder at me, and this is the freaky part. This dog was looking at me the way a person does. It had huge eyes, way too big for a greyhound, and its teeth were bared like it was considering biting me. Then it growled, but it was like a whistle growl, noises no regular animals make. It almost sounded like it wanted to talk to me, or was taunting me. Somehow, in the middle of all of this, I realized that it didn't have a tail, and I'd heard from all the Navajo stories that skinwalkers, when they appear as animals, don't have tails. Forgetting all logic and rationale, I turned and jetted. I didn't look back until I was back inside the building and had pulled the door shut behind me. And by then, when I looked, of course the thing was gone. When I described this to my brothers, they were absolutely sure it was a skinwalker, and they went through the trouble of blessing me, my apartment, them and their apartments. I never saw the creepy, bloody dog again, and I have never even slightly wanted to visit the cliff ruins. It was January of 2003 in Baxter County, Arkansas. It was around Highway 62 and the 101 intersection. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it was a cold, clear winter night. I was coming home from fishing as we rounded the 30-mile-an-hour curve right before the stop sign. We were headed south on 101, and an animal walking upright came into clear view as he was in my high beams and was on the west side shoulder. My buddy Joe, who was with me, and I said not a word to one another. We were now at maybe 20 miles an hour as we watched this big critter who was standing upright take one step and went from the far side of the shoulder to the center line, where he paused for a moment, looked us up and down. Although we felt no fear from it, Joe and I each felt like he looked at each one of us, me first and then Joe, before turning his head straight. Then he leaned forward and put his knuckles on the pavement and swung his hips through his arms and was now on the far side of the east shoulder and was gone. Late one night, my wife and I decided to go on a moonlit walk on our property to find good spots to look up at the stars because we were considering on getting a telescope. We got into the car and drove the very end of our driveway and parked. Our driveway is approximately a quarter of a mile of the main road with thick woods on both sides. We started walking up the driveway. About halfway up, we felt like we were being watched, so we stopped and we started hearing very loud noises in the woods to our left. It sounded like something was running towards us. Shocked and panicked, my wife turned and started running back towards the vehicle. My wife, Reba, said this: "I wanted to get out there as fast as I could. I told my husband to come on, and he told me to go ahead, so I ran back to the car as fast as I could. I got into the car and locked the doors." Jason, the husband, continued the story. "After my wife ran back to the vehicle, I immediately got a flashlight out of my pocket to scan the woods. I did not feel comfortable turning my back on whatever this was. I smelled a foul in the air. It is hard to describe this odor. The best way to describe it is an overwhelming, nauseating odor. It smelled like a mixture of roadkill and wet dog with a faint scent of sulfur. The best description of the sulfur smell is the smell after striking a match and blowing it out, but more potent. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. My senses were heightened and my body went into a state of alert from fear, which is not normal for me. I grew up my whole life hunting, entering the woods well before daylight and exiting the woods well after sundown. I know what deer sounds like running through the woods, and I'm familiar with local wildlife like bobcats, coyotes, raccoons, panthers, wild hogs. I'm not easily scared. There's been times that I have had to leave the woods with nothing but the backlight of a cell phone, so I don't scare easily. But this animal kept charging at me, a little bit at a time, and then it would stop and charge again. It was so loud that it sounded like a bull elephant coming through the woods at me. This was when I knew it was something that I had never heard before. I never did get a glimpse of the creature, and I did not see any eye shine. I searched high and low, scanning the woods. The animal had to be far enough into the woods to where I could not see it, but it sounded like it was right next to me, in the edge of the woods. At this point, I slowly backed up the hill, never turned around, and never showed my back, and always kept the flashlight on scanning the woods. Not knowing what to expect, I built up enough courage to shout out, "That's enough! Just stay back!" in a stern, loud voice. I doubt the creature understood anything I just said, but I was just hoping the tone I used would be enough to make it stop coming towards me. Then, shortly after I shouted, everything began to calm, and I think it understood that we were leaving the area. After feeling that I was being watched and pushed out of the area, I finally reached the top of the hill and felt it was safe to turn around, so I ran the rest of the way to the car. My wife had the doors locked, so I flashed my light and tapped on the window. She immediately unlocked the doors and I got in. Then she immediately locked the doors back, and we drove back up to the house. This was the first of many occurrences that happened on that property. It seemed that after this encounter, the activity picked up in the following months. I have heard many stories at deer camp about people seeing this creature, but I always dismissed it as folklore. But this experience made me realize that there is really something out there. This made me have the desire to look into it further and to do some of my own research, because I felt as if I were losing it. As I replay the events in my head, I try to make sense of it all, but the research I have done seems to bring me more questions than answers. My children and I were driving back from my mother's home in Cushman, Arkansas, on Thanksgiving Day, around 10 p.m. We were approaching Newark on Highway 65 South. Just outside, Macedonia Road turns off the highway to the left. We had to stop for traffic as we came up on that road. There were 2 cars in front of us. The one in front was waiting to turn left onto the road. There were 3 cars in oncoming traffic, and 1 car on the road waiting to turn left onto Highway 65 toward Newark. As our truck slowed due to the stopped traffic ahead of us, I saw something very dark in a crouched position behind the car directly in front of us. As the vehicle started to move, the figure stood and stepped all in one motion off the side of the highway. It was on 2 legs and taller than the cab of our full-size pickup. In the crouched position, it was taller than the hood of my truck. You could see the profile of a head, shoulders, back, buttocks, legs, and arms swinging wide. I was speechless. My daughter, 11 at the time, also saw the figure and said, "Did you see that?" as she locked her door. I was a major skeptic until this. It really left me scratching my head. I'd heard stories of sightings around here, but never believed any of them until now. In late November of 2000, my son and I were walking my terrier dog and looking for arrowheads along Beaver Lake. My dog began to follow a large and well-defined set of raccoon tracks along the lake shore. The shoreline was larger than usual due to the lack of rain. The morning was sunny with temperatures being about 50 degrees, sweatshirt weather. The raccoon tracks proceeded about 20 yards away from the water to an area of great disturbance in the packed sandy soil. Disturbance as in some type of scuffle. The raccoon tracks intersected with 2 sets of human-like footprints which had come from a nearby woodline. From the disturbance site, the human-type tracks returned to the woodline, but the raccoon tracks ceased to exist. We did not have a camera or tape measure, but one set of tracks were 16 to 17 inches long and about 5 to 6 inches across on the ball of the foot. The smaller set, which ran parallel to the larger, were about 11 inches in length and maybe 4 to 5 inches at the ball. The larger set were impressed in the soil about 4 inches and the smaller pair only a couple. These tracks were very flat in appearance as well. I weigh 130 pounds and my son 180. We left only faint impressions in the soil. We attempted to follow these tracks back the way they had come, but we lost sight of them in the forest as the ground was much firmer and covered with leaves. One final note. My terrier dog was whining and acting very unusual, defecating and urinating on the disturbance site, then attempting to cover the location with sand and dirt. Before I begin, I'm a 16-year-old male. About 3 years ago, I was in Virginia visiting my family over the summer. We were right outside the DC area and staying in a 2-story house near the freeway. On the other side of the freeway was a forest. So, my mom, her boyfriend Eric, and I were all staying with Eric's parents. We had brought some night vision binoculars and decided that tonight was the perfect time to use them. So, after dinner, we geared up and we headed out. We pass under the freeway and head into the woods. When we get about 5 minutes into the forest, we set down our bag and we take out our binoculars. My mom looks around with them for quite a while, seeing a few squirrels here and there. She gets tired of them and eventually passes them on to me. I look around for a while, being careful not to look at the freeway for fear of being blinded. I spot something behind a tree about 50 feet to our left. I concentrate on it, trying to figure out what it is. It looks like a pale, bald, anorexic man looking straight at us from behind a tree. I get a bit uneasy, but I'm hesitant to believe it's really there. I ask Eric to take a look, just in case. To my despair, he sees it too. He describes it much the same way I did. Now, Eric is a former amateur boxer, and I train MMA almost every day, but neither one of us wants to stick around with that thing. We start heading back to the house, crossing under the freeway. We take another look behind us as a car comes by. All 3 of us see glowing eyes lit up by the headlights on the other side of the freeway. We say fuck that and we head back to the house. When we get back, Eric's parents are asleep, and my mom and Eric go upstairs to the guest room. There's only one guest room, so I have the couch downstairs. I'm a little too excited after seeing the thing in the woods, so I end up staying up all night. Around 3 a.m., I'm watching TV and I start hearing footsteps above me. I immediately remember our earlier encounter, and I panic a little. I try to calm down and tell myself it's just one of the dogs, or maybe someone who couldn't sleep. I keep hearing the footsteps though, for a while actually, until I hear a doorknob jiggle. I find it weird that they're trying to open a locked door, but I try to ignore it. They stop, walk around for a few more minutes, and then it's quiet again. I stay up until the sun starts coming up, and then I pass out. My mom wakes me up, and I remember the footsteps from the night before. I describe what happened and ask if one of them got up at any time. She says no, and I think it must have been one of the dogs. That is, until she tells me the room above me is the office. No one was in the office, and the door stays locked at night. My heart sinks as I piece it all together. I don't know if it was that thing for sure, but I think it was. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what that was that night. I found 2 creatures that seemed to match it. I think it was either a skinwalker or possibly a wendigo. Whichever one it was, I'm just thankful that door was locked. I know I wouldn't be able to fight that thing, no matter how tough I am. Okay, so, Friday, 1:28 a.m., me and my friends decided to go for a drive. We sometimes like to go to the Llano Mountains to experience something that only happens in that area, paranormal and supernatural. Like any other time we do this, we go in my car and drive past Home Hill, going towards the mountains and park across from VHS about 1.5 miles away. Then we sit and take in the scenic beauty of the dark desert, starting by listen closely to anything and looking everywhere, being hyper observant. At first, we saw a light in the distance, traveling flat on the desert land, getting within about a mile away from us, then disappearing altogether. Moving on from where I had to see something else. Driving through roads and flying by at least 30 miles an hour over the speed limit, we turned down a familiar road. This is where we knew that something was about to change me and everyone else. We all looked to the right side of the car, and we all saw what we believed to be something like a skinwalker. A massive black dog just hunched over at my car while I was going 45 miles an hour through the road. We should have felt impact from the massive creature, but we didn't. Both people in the back seat looked and saw this thing rise up from the ground and stand straight up on two legs, absolutely huge and all black with red eyes that are forever imprinted in my mind. I didn't slow down, but sped up, going about 55 miles an hour now, so probably about 20 yards away they saw it rise up, as if nothing happened to it. Several friends and myself had gone together to purchase 120 acres of cut-over forest land that was totally surrounded by several thousand acres of timber company land. This land was at the end of a small valley and at the far end of a dead-end road. On my portion of the land was a small rise in the northern half of the valley, and I was working on building a shack to be used for hunting and camping. One night, about 8 p.m., while working inside by lantern light, I decided to step outside on the deck for a cigarette. As soon as I lit my lighter, a roaring, crackling scream commenced from the slope of the ridge to the south, about 300 yards away, but in direct line of sight. I was too startled to do anything but stay rooted to the spot and feel the hair stand up on the back of my neck, something which hasn't happened to me in years. While the scream lasted for only a couple of seconds, it seemed to go on for very, very long. Since it was very cloudy and dark, I ran inside for a flashlight, all the while wishing I had brought my rifle inside from the truck. With a flashlight and a hatchet, I headed for the truck, only to find that the truck itself seemed to be moving. In the bed of the truck, I found my German Shepherd. I had forgotten all about him, curled in a tight ball in the corner and shaking so hard he was moving the whole truck. We left immediately. Several nights later, one of the friends who had laughed at me when I told the story came out to see how I was progressing with the shack. He laughed more at the extra lanterns I had placed inside and outside, and at the pistol and shotgun I had laying on the table. We stepped out onto the lit deck, and almost immediately the same grating scream came at exactly the same spot on the south ridge. In a flash, my friend was standing back to back with me as we stared out into the dark. Since the dog was not with us, and because we were armed and had good flashlights, we stayed there for about 2 more hours, but heard nothing else. But I was certainly glad to have a witness this time. Several weeks later, my friend and I ran into one of the other property owners and were relating the story to him when I noticed him becoming a bit pale. He finally told us that he had been burning piles of deadfall on his part of the property that butts into the south ridge, and was walking back and forth to the stream to get water to put out several of the fires when he heard something walking around him in the woods. It was too dark to see, but he at first assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear. After he had listened for a while, he decided it sounded like a two-legged creature and believed it was one of us trying to play a joke on him. So, he continued putting out his fires while listening to whatever it was make a circle around him. But when it got upwind from him, he began to smell a terrible odor that he admitted scared him so badly that he got in his truck and left, ignoring his still smoldering fires. I cannot say what it was that we heard or what the other man had smelt, but I have heard several kinds of big cats, bears, howler monkeys, and other large animals in my years hunting and in the army, and I have never heard anything that sounded remotely like what was heard those 2 nights. Wednesday, October 12th, 2005. Our neighbor's dog were very active and barking all night. The next morning about 5:30 a.m., my own dog was barking in the backyard. I opened the door to calm her down, and I heard something in the back of our property, near the fruit trees. It was very heavy sounding, and I could hear branches breaking as it departed. The next morning around 8:30, my husband went to his truck in the backyard and heard something behind our shop take off running. He thought it was a hunter and ran to the back to listen. He thought it sounded like it was on 2 feet. He said it stomped very heavily as it was running through the woods, and he could hear snorting. Sunday, October 16th, I went walking around the neighborhood road and discovered several sets of large and small bare footprints on the gray slate road in front of our house. At first, I thought it was a child's footprint until I looked closer. There were 2 sets. The largest measured 13.5 by 7 inches, and the small print measured 9 by 4 inches. I took pictures of all the prints and measured each one. They consistently measured the same size. The large print is about 3 inches wider than my husband's foot, and he's a rather big man. Well, I live in Bentonville, Arkansas right now. My dad owned his own business. One day, we got on the subject. I was telling him that I had bought a little book of ghost stories and Bigfoot sightings and how I was very, very interested in Bigfoot. Then he told me that he had seen Bigfoot before and told me the whole story. At first, I didn't believe him, but a couple of years later, he told me the same story when we got on the topic again. The story is that he was riding ATVs with his friends around or in either Lost Bridge Lake over Beaver Lake, and he was at that front of the group of four-wheelers, and they were going down this hill that led to a dirt road. Since he was in the front of the group, he went down first and got on the dirt road and stopped to wait for the rest of the group to come down. Before they came down, he looked over across the dirt road on the other side of the hill, on the tree line where the evening sun was shining through the trees, and seen the Bigfoot walking. He said it was taking really big steps and appeared to be around 8 feet tall. He couldn't see the color because the sun was shining through the trees and Bigfoot, so it appeared as a shadow. Then the rest of the group came down, and he told them what he saw, and they did not believe him. That's all he told me. He told me he couldn't remember every detail, but he still knows more than me. I can't remember everything. The reason I'm telling you and not him is that I probably couldn't get him to tell you. I'm telling you this because I'm learning about Bigfoot in our biology class at Bentonville High School. My teacher is a marine biologist and a cryptozoologist. We watched the Bigfoot movie and the legend of Boggy Creek in class. To start this story off, and to give a little insight about me, I'm an 18-year-old female who grew up in Michigan and have lived in the country for as long as I can remember. And for heads up in this is a long story, so please bear with me. Now, back to the story. On one particular hot summer weekend, me and a couple of friends, including my boyfriend, let's call him Tony, and my older brother, let's call him Brad, decided we were going to do some camping for the weekend, since it was such a nice warm week. Tony's parents had owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But, being stupid teenagers, we didn't really think about that. All we were ready for was to party like any normal teenagers would. Well, after being there for 2 hours, our fun had started. Tony's friends had brought a ton of alcohol and weed to last us for the weekend, so we wouldn't be bored since we had no service and only movies to watch. After it got around 12 a.m. and was pitch black, we had a huge bonfire going. It was a total of 6 people, including me and Tony. As we talked and laughed about coming up events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't even notice that my brother had literally frozen his eyes to one section of the woods. Mind you, we were all intoxicated and high at the time. Eventually, our talking ceased when Tony realized his friend and my brother had an emotionless expression. "Hey dude, you alright?" he asked Brad. Silence. Brad didn't reply or even make any movements that would indicate he heard him. After that, I started to get scared, as well as the other two girls there. It took a lot for my brother to act that way. Eventually, I was the first to catch on what he was excessively staring into a certain spot in the woods. I turned my head and followed his gaze the best I could. And when I finally caught on to what he was staring at, my heart dropped. There, right fucking there, was at first look a dog. At least, that's what I thought. It was some person's dog that had wandered off. But then my brain kicked in and I realized there wasn't neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? My mind started to race while Tony still tried to get Brad to speak even more. In one motion, this thing stood up tall. And when I say tall, I mean gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet tall. Everyone has seen it then. How could you not? The other two girls and the other boy with us gasped as they finally grasped why my brother was still as hell. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Tony was the first to talk. "No tail," he mumbled. No one heard what he said but Brad. And I swear to you, when I say his eyes widen as big as pan saucers, that freaked me out immediately. "What did you say?" one of the girls had asked. "It has no fucking tail," he hissed at her. My heartbeat stopped. He was right. There was no tail on this thing. Suddenly, my clouded alcohol mind cleared up in a fraction of a second when I finally realized that what this thing was exactly. Now, I understand why my brother was basically shitting his pants. This thing was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there. But before I could nope the fuck out of there, this thing let off a terrible stench, like rotting meat before screaming inhuman-like. The sound was enough to scare the hell out of everyone. My brother was the first up out of his chair and started shouting native words out to the creature and why I told everyone to get the hell inside. No one questioned me when they seen just how dead serious I was, especially Tony. He's never seen me so scared, so he knew it was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at the creature, which seemed to keep it at bay, while I gave us enough time to get inside. He slammed and locked the door before turning all the lights off and grabbing a special ash from the kitchen counters and started throwing it at every window and door, all while chanting. Of course, he had everyone freaked out and basically in tears at that moment. After he was done, no one said a word for a long time. All of us were still in shock. He grabbed our dad's pistol and had it posted by him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what happened. We must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to my brother packing all of our stuff into 2 cars early in the morning. I understood why. We had native family. We knew what we were dealing with, and we knew it would come back. And maybe, just maybe, not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin and spoke a few calming words to the still very freaked out young girls. We left as soon as everything was packed up. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly to our friends what happened that night, and they never bothered to ask us either.